Hello and welcome back to the Training Tom podcast, the place where I share the lessons I have learned, the challenges I'm currently facing, and the questions I have of my future self. And today's episode is part 1 in a series called Mental Health and Me. And in part 1, I'll be sharing some of my experiences with managing my mental health. Before we get started with this episode, I have a quick message to share. The Mental Health and Me series is a series where I share my own experiences and challenges with mental health in the hope that I can raise awareness. I also hope it helps support people who may be experiencing mental health challenges to feel less alone. Also, I am not a therapist, so I'm speaking only from my experiences and what I have learned through that process. Second, if you are struggling or someone you know is struggling with their mental health and you have immediate concerns about your own well-being or the well-being of somebody else, then you should call the emergency services or attend your local hospital. Alternatively, if you or someone you know could use some support for their mental health, I have provided some links to places where you can find support in the description. These links include charity helplines that you can contact any day at any time, and charities that provide online resources to help people understand their mental health better. Finally, seeking help is the first step to managing your mental health better. Thank you, and on with the episode. Okay, so managing my mental health, my experiences. The first thing I want to say at the start of this episode is that I appreciate this is a very sensitive topic. Mental health is something that is becoming a lot more, has gathered a lot more momentum and has raised a lot more awareness in, I'd say, even the past 5 to 10 years. It's only been something that we've been starting to become aware of, and people have been sharing their own experiences and their stories of managing their mental health. And that's very much what I want this series to be about, is me sharing my experiences to raise awareness and also to hopefully help people feel less alone. Now, because it is a very sensitive topic, I also want to do this in the right way, and I'm very cautious of talking about mental health and making sure that I do it in a sensitive way, because everybody has their own experiences. It might be through supporting somebody else, or it might be your own personal experiences that will, perhaps by listening to this, raise some thoughts about your own experiences and the challenges that you have faced. So I do want to do this in a very sensitive way, and I want to be mindful of the fact that everybody experiences mental health differently. And I think that's a very key thing for me to remember, but also all of us to remember listening to this, is that we do all experience mental health in our own way. And I am simply sharing my experiences and perhaps a little bit of my opinions on mental health in this series as well. So it's very much going to be based around my experiences and the way that I manage my mental health, in the hope that it supports other people as well. Now, on that note, and on the note of wanting to kind of do this right, I'm going to be kind of referring back to some notes as I go through this episode, just so that I can stay on track and so that I can make sure that I am sharing the information that I want to share, and, like I said at the start, doing this in a sensitive way as well. And the first thing I want to touch on is briefly explaining my experience through childhood with the lens of hindsight. Now, not just childhood, but through my teenage years and my young adult life as well. So, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, I'm 27 years old, so I'm going to be talking about that early experiences with mental health in a view of hindsight, so that I clarify my own thoughts on that, but also to perhaps get other people to think about some of the experiences that they've had that perhaps they didn't realise was a mental health challenge, or was perhaps something that has led them to a challenge they're experiencing at the moment. So to briefly explain a bit about my childhood, first of all, I feel like I had a very stable and secure childhood, which I'm very grateful for, because I know that's not the case for everybody. So yes, I do feel very grateful that I had a very stable and secure childhood. I also feel grateful for the support that I had around me in my childhood as well. I was a very happy child from what I remember, and I hope my parents would agree with that, because yeah, they did provide a very good environment for myself and my sister to grow up in, and were very supportive of us as well. And mental health was a conversation that we had. It was conversations around simply talking about the way that you're feeling, and my parents were very open with that as well, which I think helps leading into my teenage years and my adulthood life in particular, because I have felt more open to things like therapy as well. So yeah, my parents were very open with the fact that we should not necessarily express how we feel, but talk about some of the feelings we might be experiencing, and encouraged us to do that, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I had a very happy childhood, and I was encouraged to talk about the way that I was feeling through the upbringing that I had from my parents. And up until, I would say, high school, I didn't have any awareness, or didn't have much awareness of me experiencing mental health challenges. And I think that is partly because of the upbringing that I had, the very supportive environment that I was in. I think it was also because there wasn't much awareness of it at that moment in time either. As I moved into my teenage years, that's when I started to notice, and this is only in hindsight as well, because at the time I didn't realise this, but in hindsight I realised that perhaps my mental health was not in the best place that it could be, especially compared to my childhood and my early years. So the thing that I noticed when I moved into my teenage years, and particularly when I started to hit puberty, was that I became very insecure. My confidence was very low, my self-esteem was very low as well, and I partly wonder whether that was because of the environment that I was in at school. So for the first 3 years of high school, I was in single-sex classes, and that meant that I often placed a lot of comparison on the other male peers that I had in my classes. And I didn't consider myself to be smart. I didn't consider myself to be stupid either. I didn't consider myself to be one of the most athletic people, but I also didn't consider myself to be not athletic at all. I always considered myself to be very average. And that meant that I wasn't very confident in myself, and it also meant that I felt quite insecure at the same time. And again, this is only in hindsight that I'm coming to realise this. But I did absolutely at the time notice that I didn't feel good enough, and I felt like I was quite an insecure teenager. So that was, again, in hindsight, one of the first things that I can kind of pick up on from my early experiences of mental health challenges without necessarily realising it at that moment in time. And at school, people might have realised that, they might not have realised that, but I know within myself that I was a very insecure teenager. And that perhaps had led me on to some of the ways that I behaved, and I experienced my mental health challenges as I went into adulthood as well. I had a lot of anxious thoughts because I was comparing myself to other people, and those anxious thoughts became a lot more prevalent as I moved into my GCSEs, and we moved into mixed set classes, or mixed sex education. So boys and girls would mix together at GCSEs, but would be separated from year 7 to years 9, which was very unique for a school, unless you went to a grammar school or something like that, where typically, especially in Chelmsford and Essex, there was a boys' grammar school and there was a girls' grammar school, where they'd be separated all the way through to year 11. Whereas at the high school that I went to, we were separated from year 7 to years 9, and then we were combined at GCSEs. And I remember being very anxious at that moment in time, because really I hadn't spoken to that many girls. I was talking to obviously my mates through year 7 and year 9, and there might be like a few girls that we would talk to and have kind of friendships with, but it wasn't in teaching and it wasn't in the classroom that much. So moving into GCSEs, I remember becoming very anxious around that. And again, that comparison element came into things. Because I felt very insecure as a teenager, I didn't consider myself to be that good at anything. I just considered myself to be very average. And when I was comparing myself to my mates, and obviously being at that kind of age and you're looking to start dating and things like that, I just became even more insecure than what I was in the first place. So that was a very challenging experience for me as well. But actually I realised very quickly that I grew in confidence. Now, whether that confidence was genuine confidence or whether it was me masking those insecurities through confidence is a different story. And perhaps it's something in the future that I'll reflect back on and realise one way or the other. At this moment in time, I think that confidence was born, first of all, from realising that nothing bad would happen being in mixed sex classrooms, but also from masking my insecurities as well, and trying not to let people see that I had those insecurities and that I lacked confidence. I masked my lack of confidence by trying to be more confident. I was also quite a chubby kid when I was growing up. I wouldn't ever consider myself to be fat or obese, but I was perhaps borderline overweight and quite chubby. And when I got through to my GCSEs, I had a bit of a growth spurt, started going to the gym. And when I started going to the gym, that built my confidence as well, because I was building muscle and I was becoming more athletic. And people perhaps paid a bit more attention to me for that reason as well. So through high school in particular, to kind of summarize this section, through high school, I was very insecure. I was quite anxious as well, and I compared myself to my peers a lot. And that kind of then festered and increased that awareness of my insecurities and those anxious thoughts that I was having. And I would say that carried through until the end of my A-levels, where I was in the same school for GCSEs and for A-levels, and a lot of people moved from GCSEs into A-levels, so there wasn't much of a transition for me. It's not like I went to a different place, and it's not like I was meeting new people. So that confidence and that masking of confidence was perhaps carried through into my A-levels. Then when I moved into university, it was an opportunity to become a new person and to present myself in the way that I wanted to be presented. Rather than masking myself with confidence, I just perhaps embraced a bit more of who I was and almost went in the opposite direction. I wasn't trying to gain people's trust. I wasn't trying to become friends with everybody like I was trying to do during my GCSEs and my A-levels. I actually just was a bit more of a recluse during university. And I was also paying for my education. So rather than considering myself to not be very smart and not be very intelligent, I tried a lot harder during university to be seen as intelligent, because I wanted to graduate with a first class honours and I was paying for my education. So I wanted to get the best grade I could because I was paying for it. And that meant that my experience of university was very different to my experience of high school and my A-levels, where yes, I had friends and I had good mates that I'm still in contact with at the moment, but I wasn't anywhere near as social as I was during my GCSEs and my A-levels. There were periods of time through university where I was sober for a while because, again, I was so focused on my studies. I wanted to graduate with that first class honours to prove to myself that I was intelligent, or to possibly even prove to other people that I wasn't just average. So that element of insecurity was still within me, or that feeling of not being good enough was still within me, because I was perhaps studying really hard for the wrong reasons. I thought that if I graduated with a first class honours, people would view me differently because I'd got the top grade, and therefore they might like me more, therefore it might give me more opportunities in my career, and it would just give me confidence. And the first key moment that I want to expand on, now that I've briefly explained my kind of childhood, my adolescent, teenage and young adulthood experience, the first key moment that I want to touch on that really highlighted to me that I was perhaps struggling with my mental health, or experiencing a mental health challenge as I sometimes like to term it, was in my final year of university. And through this period of uni, it was in my second semester. So I was coming towards the end of my studies, and all of a sudden it dawned on me that I didn't know what was next. I had my whole life ahead of me, but I was petrified because I didn't know what to do with it. Before I went off to university, I had an idea of what career I wanted to go into. That changed while I was at university, and it got to my final year and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what career would be the right thing for me. At one point, I almost did a panic master's as well. Now, I didn't do that master's qualification, but in that depth of the real challenge I was experiencing with my mental health, one of the big symptoms that I noticed was that I isolated myself from my peers even more than what I normally would. Now, through my university, because I didn't want to party that much and I was so focused on my studies, I'll apologise now to my course mates, but I used to create a lot of excuses not to go out and party and to avoid that social element that is a massive part of university. Now, that got better in my second year, and yeah, perhaps in my third year as well. But especially in my first year, I would often create excuses not to go out and not to socialise with people because, yeah, of my insecurities and my lack of confidence. This really came to a head in that final year, in that second semester, when I was focusing on the future and what the future would look like, and I realised I didn't know what the future would look like. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but if you've been off to university and you've graduated, I don't know if it dawned on you, but for me, it massively dawned on me that everything in my life had been laid out for me up until that point. So you go to nursery, you go to school, or you go to infant school in the UK, you then go to high school, you then do A-levels or college, you then go off to university, and then you then get a job. So all the steps were kind of laid out in front of you. And it was perhaps society's expectation of what you would do as well. But it got to the step of finishing university and getting a job, and I realised, A, I didn't know what job I wanted to do, and B, I didn't know what was after getting a job. I felt very stuck and very confused because everything had been laid out ahead of me. Now there was only one step ahead of me, and it was to get a job, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And that made me panic massively. Now, I had experienced panic attacks before in the past, but only one or two. But during that second semester of my final year, I had a panic attack while I was at the gym, and it felt like I was having a heart attack. I couldn't catch my breath, I was having heart palpitations, felt like my heart was trying to beat out of my chest at points, and I even went to the GP at uni and got some investigations done on my heart and my chest. Luckily, there was nothing wrong with my heart, but the conversation of it being a panic attack never arose. It wasn't until I then started to, like I said, isolate myself quite a lot. And this isolation got so bad that, so I was living in a house with 7 people. And it got so bad that at times I would wait until the house was quiet and I knew that nobody was in the kitchen before I would leave my room, go downstairs, make some food as quickly as possible before going back up to my room and eating, and then trying to spend as much time away from other people as I possibly could. And again, I'll apologise to my housemates now because There were times where people would knock on my door and I would just ignore it because I didn't want to talk to anybody. Or there were times when I thought nobody was in the house, I'd go downstairs and make some food, and then somebody would come downstairs and start talking to me, and I just wouldn't want to talk to them. So again, I'm really sorry to my housemates. It was just the place that I was in was that I wanted to be alone because I thought nobody else was experiencing what I was experiencing. So I thought that I was alone in what I was experiencing and the thought processes that I was having, so I might as well be alone. And this got so bad that for maybe 2 or 3 days, I wasn't looking after my personal hygiene. I wasn't eating properly, and I don't think I left the house for a good 2 or 3 days. And that was when I realised that something wasn't quite right. Like, it's not normal to isolate yourself and try and make yourself as alone as possible. And I also was feeling rubbish. I felt awful. Like I say, I hadn't been out of the house in a couple of days, maybe even a bit longer than that. I hadn't been exercising, I hadn't been eating properly, I hadn't been sleeping properly. Like, I was getting, maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep and then waking up and then ruminating on my thoughts and then not being able to get back to sleep. So I was suffering with what you might term as insomnia as well. So all of these things were kind of building up and building up and building up. And all of a sudden, I realised that's not normal. Now, luckily, through the university, I was able to reach out to the wellbeing team because I knew that there was a wellbeing team. Initially, I emailed the wrong people, but luckily they put me in contact with the right people. And from that point, I was able to get some counselling through the university. I spoke to one of the wellbeing counsellors at the uni, and it was at that point that they explained to me that what I was experiencing could be termed, I wasn't diagnosed by this counsellor because they weren't able to diagnose me, but they suggested that what I was experiencing was something called generalised anxiety disorder. And that was when kind of the penny dropped that I'd been experiencing this for a lot of my teenage and young adult life. But it wasn't until all of those symptoms had piled up on top of each other and I felt so trapped that I got help and was able to understand why I was feeling that way. And essentially, all of those feelings were from a fear of failure and those insecurities topping up and getting on top of me because I hadn't addressed them. I hadn't realised that they were the thoughts that I was experiencing during my teenage years and during my young adult life were those anxious thoughts, and that I was having anxious thoughts about all sorts of different things. Leaving the house, what if I got hit by a car? What if I went to the gym and I got those heart palpitations again, and this time it was a heart attack and I died while I was at the gym? All those catastrophizing, a term that we can call it is catastrophizing thoughts, that I didn't realise at the time was related to experiencing anxious thoughts and potentially experiencing anxiety. So that was the first key moment for me, and luckily I was able to get some support, like I say, from the counsellors at uni, and after that I was then able to pick myself up out of that hole with the support of the counsellors and by doing things that supported me. And in a future episode, or in part 2, I'm going to be explaining how therapy has supported me and the lessons that I have learned in that. But that was key moment number 1. Now, moving on to key moment number 2 was a few years later. I was in between jobs. So I'd left the job that I had immediately after I'd finished university. I had a period of about 6 months where I tried to start my own business in personal training and lifestyle coaching. And that business wasn't working out. And my anxious thoughts started to resurface during that period of time. And again, I started to get into that trap of isolating myself and not wanting to talk to my mates because I didn't have any money and I didn't think I was good enough, and those insecurities started to return. Those insecurities came to a head when I applied for a job and I got a job interview. And I received a phone call from the company that I had applied to, and it's the company that I work for now. And I didn't pick up the phone straight away. In fact, I didn't pick up the phone at all when they left a message and asked me to call them back. And my anxious thoughts were so strong and my insecurities were so strong at that moment in time that I almost didn't call back the company, because I catastrophized and had gone back to that university version of myself and thought, I'm never going to get the job anyway, so what's the point? They're not going to like me, I don't have enough experience. Started creating all of these excuses as to why I wouldn't get the job. And it highlighted to me again that I was in that place where those anxious thoughts were surfacing. Now, I was able to overcome those anxious thoughts and I did call the company back. I went to the job interview, and again, before the interview, I was feeling really anxious. Those thoughts, those catastrophizing thoughts, those not good enough feelings were surfacing. But I did the interview, got invited back for a second interview, and I ended up getting the job. And at that point, it was about, I think, a few months after I got the job, because I got the job right at the start of the pandemic. So we then went on to furlough, and there's a whole story related to that perhaps I'll share in another episode as well. But it wasn't until a couple of months later, when I was back at work, that I spoke to my manager and I explained the story to him of how I nearly didn't attend the interview. And luckily, through my employer, he was able to point me in the direction of getting some support for my emotional well-being. And I was even nervous and anxious of talking to my manager about asking if there was any support that I could get through work, because I was worried that he would say something like, oh, you didn't tell me this when you first joined, so we might have to have a conversation about whether you should be employed with us or not. He wasn't like that at all. In fact, if anything, he was the complete opposite and very supportive and encouraged me to get the support that I needed. And that, again, it was a very useful exercise for me, because I was able to talk through what I was experiencing and the feelings that I was having. And like I say, in part 2, I'll share a bit about that experience of therapy and counselling and how it changed my perspective and supported me in the way that it did. So that was key moment number 2. And lastly, there's key moment number 3, which was actually quite recently, and it was in the summer of 2024. And this key moment was actually something where I felt like I was in a really good place at the time. And one of the things that I noticed, and I have noticed over the past decade really, is that I'm not very good at being in touch with my emotions. I can count on one hand how many times I've cried in the past decade, which I don't think is very healthy. And one thing that became explicitly clear to me that wasn't very healthy was my sister was having a conversation with me at one point, and she stopped the conversation and she said something along the lines of, when I'm talking to you, it's almost like you're not there. It's almost like you're occupied with something else and you're just not here. You're not present. And that really hit me, because I always say to my family and I always say to my friends, if you've ever got any problems, please come and talk to me, because I want to be a listening ear, and if I can provide you with any support, I want to be able to support you through that. So the fact that my own sister was saying that I'm talking to you and you're not listening to what I'm saying, you're not even present in the conversation, was something that I didn't want to carry through with me for the rest of my life. So because I was in a good place, I feel like I had that awareness to recognise that as perhaps being a catalyst for issues later on down the line. So again, I reached out through my employer to get some mental health support and to discuss why I'm not in touch with my emotions as well as I could be. And yeah, that was a really useful exercise. And again, in part 2, I will share what I learned through that exercise of having therapy, and then the most recent example, I had CBT, or cognitive behavioural therapy as it's called, and how it was a really useful exercise for me understanding more, not just about my mental health, but myself in general, and how I feel it will help answer some of the questions I have for myself and my future self. Now, why am I sharing all of these things? I'm sharing all of these things from my experience so that perhaps you can understand some of the symptoms that I was experiencing and the depths that I went into before noticing how extreme those symptoms were. Now, I must confess, I said at the start of this episode that I don't consider my mental health challenges to have been that severe. I will be completely open with everybody and say that I have never had suicidal thoughts. And I consider myself very lucky to have never had those suicidal thoughts, because I've got friends and I know people that have lost loved ones to suicide. And I've got friends that have had those suicidal thoughts and been very open with me that they've had them. So I don't consider my mental health challenges to be very extreme. However, one thing that has been a consistent theme throughout my life is having an awareness of the way that you're feeling. Like I said, my parents instilled in me from a very young age, if you ever have anything wrong, please talk to us. And yes, as a teenager and as a young adult, you don't think you need your parents' support. But them telling that to me and saying that to me from a very young age, I think has helped me realise before it's been too late that I'm experiencing some challenges and that I need to get support for that. Now, when I was at university, I didn't speak to my parents and tell them that I was struggling. I went and got the counselling before I told my parents, by the way, I was experiencing this while I was at uni and this is what I did about it. So I'm not perfect. It's not like I spoke to my parents and my parents said, go and speak to the wellbeing team, they'll be able to support you. I didn't tell them. And there are still a lot of instances where I don't tell people how I'm feeling. So it's a challenge that I'm currently facing, is to be more open with the way that I'm feeling. But one thing that those experiences have taught me is that every time I go and have therapy, or every time I speak to a friend and express how I'm feeling, I'm catching the mental health challenge earlier, before it spirals. I would say in the past 2 to 3 years, I have experienced challenges with my mental health, but I've been able to catch it sooner because I've been away and done the work earlier in my life. You know, that experience that I had at university, that key moment number 1, was a big catalyst for me getting support and getting therapy and understanding what therapy does for you, first of all, but understanding how much I can isolate myself and what symptoms are particular for me. I think that's a really key point, is that everybody's symptoms around their mental health will be different. Just because I isolate myself and I want to be alone, or I feel like I want to be alone, and I don't look after myself physically, I don't look after myself with my hygiene perhaps, I'm not sleeping very well, all of those different symptoms are very personal to me. The panic attacks that I experience, even the panic attacks could be very individual to me with the way that I experience them. What I am trying to say is that through those experiences, I can now notice when I need to get help, which I think is a really important thing. And I also, through having therapy, and like I say, I'll go on to talk about this in part 2, I know how to manage those challenges better as well, so that I don't go into that depth of isolation, of wanting to feel alone, of not sleeping better, and catching my mental health before it spirals into something more severe and something more challenging. So yeah, that is my experience of mental health and some key moments of when I've realised my mental health has not been in the best place. But also in terms of therapy, not waiting until it's too late before going to get therapy. Like I said in key moment number 3, I was actually in a very good place with myself, with my mind, but something that somebody said to me was a catalyst that perhaps I needed to go back to therapy to try and unpack another area that I hadn't dived into before. But in part 2, I'll explain a little bit more about how I use therapy and the benefits I've found through therapy as well, which I think will be really important, especially for somebody that perhaps is listening that hasn't experienced therapy before and maybe doesn't feel like their mental health is severe enough to go to therapy. I think this is one thing that we forget, is that we often think of therapy as being a last resort, and this is me sharing my opinion on therapy at the moment. We often see therapy as a last resort, but often the sooner we go to therapy, the better equipped we are to embrace therapy and utilize it in the best way possible. That's, again, just from my experience and my opinion as well. And an analogy that comes to mind, or not an analogy, but again, my opinion of that is that when it comes around to our physical health, we will almost like prioritize our physical health and maybe try and do things to look after our physical health. Whether that be going to the gym, whether that be looking at your diet. And we also perhaps do things that don't look after our physical health, like drinking excessive amounts of alcohol or smoking. Those just being, or not exercising and not eating the right things. But our physical health is often spoken about in a lot of detail. You know, you have we talk about physical health a lot, and mental health is something that we talk about with a lot of negative connotations. We don't always talk about physical health with negative connotations. We talk about how you can support your physical health. But we often view mental health from a different lens, where we talk about mental health conditions and we talk about the help that people can get when they're struggling with their mental health. We don't talk about mental health as simply being mental health. A part of our health, just like our physical health is, just like our social health is, and mental health is part of our health, our overall well-being, our overall health. We view mental health as being a problem, or somebody has a mental health condition, or somebody has a mental health issue that needs to be addressed. But we don't look at mental health as being this constant process. Just like our physical health, we constantly have physical health challenges, or we constantly do things to look after and support our physical health. Do we always do things, or do we always prioritize things that look after our mental health? And in my opinion, I don't think we do. I think we often wait, and I will hold my hands up and say that through the experiences that I've shared today, I've often waited until I've needed support before going and getting support. I've often gone and got the support, implemented the steps to make my mental health better, and then stopped implementing the steps. And then my mental health has got worse because I'm not implementing the things that support my mental health. And we almost wait until our mental health is in a poor place before we get support, rather than thinking about the things that we can do to support our mental health on a continual basis. Just like we would do with our physical health by going to the gym, or by exercising, or by eating the right things, we're doing that to constantly look after our physical health. But I guess a question I have for you, and a question that I have for myself, is what are you doing at the moment to look after your mental health? I mentioned in the previous episode a challenge that I'm currently facing and a way that I'm trying to manage my mental health better through journaling. And you can go back to that episode to listen to that episode and the challenge that I'm currently facing. But one thing that I want to bring into 2025, and not just 2025, but the rest of my life, is implementing steps to support my mental health on a continual basis. Yes, I might still have mental health challenges, but at least I'm doing things proactively rather than reactively. And I think to summarize this last point before I end the episode, we look at mental health from a reactive standpoint rather than from a proactive standpoint. And this is my opinion of things, and maybe other people have different opinions and different perspectives. But I think the way that the media portrays mental health is that we look at it from a reactive standpoint rather than a proactive standpoint. And I think if we were all much more proactive with supporting our mental health, then perhaps mental health awareness would be viewed in a different way. And perhaps from a more simple standpoint, maybe there'd be more people alive today. And I know I want to be very sensitive about this, but I think there's also some truth behind that, in that mental health for a long time has been very, very reactive. Not just from a personal perspective, but also in the way that we viewed it as society. We react to people that are struggling. What would happen if we were more proactive instead? And we all from a young age understood how we can proactively support our mental health, and we viewed it as part of our health in general rather than as an isolated component. That's a thought for all of us to perhaps go away with and understand how we can all proactively look after our mental health better. I'm going to leave this episode here though. This was part 1 in the series of mental health and me. Part 2, I'll be looking at the lessons I have learned from therapy. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening. My name is Tom Regan, and this is the Training Tom podcast.